Thank you. Well, it is an absolute pleasure to be here, particularly when, following on stage people whose work have absolutely fundamentally impacted a lot of the work that we have done at Founders4Schools and also the Scale Up Institute over the last 5-6 years since I started really concentrating on this area. I'm a little bit different from the other two speakers in that I'm mainly a practitioner, having started out as a computer programmer and then turned into an entrepreneur and then turned into an investor in companies like LinkedIn, which I'll be talking a little bit about later, Love Film, Zoopla, and these sorts of things. Quasi-academic when I was asked by David Willett, so I think years later, to write the Scale Up report on economic growth. And that focused on changing policies to look at the benefits of focusing some of our policies on growing companies rather than small, medium, or large companies, and what would happen at an economic, systemic level if we made those changes. To now, again, sort of executive chair rather than sort of chief exec of Founders4Schools, which is absolutely dedicated to focusing on the transition to work between children between 6 and 24. So thank you for doing everything that you have done, because it's fed everything that I've done. And Prue, again, your work as well has been really, really important to me. So I usually gobble up research rather than talk about research that we've done. What I'm going to go through today is some research that we've done, focusing on just under 500,000 student-employer encounters between the age of 6 and 24, with some musings. I think it gives me more questions and provocations than answers, but that's a good thing, because we're all researchers, so maybe some of you will pick this up afterwards, because I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done. I'm going to talk about the pace of technological changing in education and use some examples that Anthony had talked about earlier with Uber as well. I'm going to talk about policies, both policies for teacher attainment and productivity and student attainment, releasing some key data that I think I would love for more data and more research to be done in this area, so that we can exchange information more easily and build on each other's really good work in this area, so that we can get to the answers that we need, because we need some of the answers. And I'm going to touch on the relationship between those activities and macroeconomic growth, really at a UK level rather than OECD level, but maybe Anthony can take this forward and think about what the macroeconomic implications are over time. So we're talking about unleashing the power of business community into the classroom to a certain extent. We're also talking about unleashing the power of students into businesses. We're also going to talk about unleashing the power of AI and machine learning into education in new and innovative ways. Everybody's talking about AI in financial services and film and everywhere else, where I'm going to look a little bit about how it's being unleashed into education, using lessons from other industries, and starting to show us some glimmers of hope and help, I think, as well. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about collaboration, which strangely builds on the thesis that I did in 1993 when I was doing a master's degree. But it was really looking at what is the benefit of collaboration between institutions and organizations. My graduate thesis was on high-tech companies. I think really for the last 25 years, and certainly for the last 10 years, been looking really, really hard at collaboration between educational institutions, governments, and business, and what together can be gained by collaborations of that nature that alone we cannot achieve. Anyway, so hopefully you'll find some of that interesting. On business, one of the things that I've been really, really impacted on, and this is firstly through the work at the Scale Up Institute, is that 100% of the net new jobs across Europe come from companies that are less than 5 years old. And if that's the case, what does that mean for us? Think about 100% net new jobs from now. That's OECD, and it also is the case of where the jobs come from in the US. Adzuna does analysis of research looking at the open jobs that cannot be filled. And there are 990,000 jobs that cannot be filled that are being advertised for right now. And so, I know we do worry about NEETs, but I also worry about, from an economic systemic point of view, the fact that those companies that are growing cannot fill those positions, which in turn means that they cannot take on additional customer orders, which actually has a really bad dampening effect on our economic growth, which post-Brexit or even pre-Brexit, we absolutely do not need at all. When we survey, since 2014, we have surveyed the fast-growing companies that are called the scale-up companies and asked them, what is the single most important thing that would allow you to accept more customer orders? And 93% of them are worried about the skills that are coming out of our secondary schools and our universities. And that has become worse since 2014. That's the current figure. In 2014, it was 82%. So in 2014, 82% people said, this is the most important thing, skills, and that's now at 93%. So sadly, the problem is getting worse rather than getting better. But the good news is that we can do things about it. I think you'll be familiar with the really excellent research done by the World Economic Forum, talking about the skills that are required as opposed to the academic qualifications that are required. And you can see that there's a change, again, between 2015 and 2020. There indeed will be another change before 2025. And if we're currently educating people now who will graduate in 2025, then we should think about what those skills are. And if we're policymakers, we should really think about what those skills are. And I know that you had Tom Ravenscraft here yesterday, and I think some of the work that he is doing is really fundamentally important. And I'm excited about what that bodes for us. If you're looking at, when we analyzed the data coming out of employers, the 93% of them are saying they can't grow anymore right now because they can't hire people. These are the skills that they say that they need, which are similar sort of collaboration that what you found in the World Economic Forum. So business skills, management skills, technical, social, strangely financial skills are not the highest on their priority, which is a little bit out of sync with what was being said earlier. So I don't know why that's the case, but the fast-growing companies seem to be worrying about those slightly less than in other quarters. I'm going from here to the Royal Society and was involved in their research that was looking at the STEM skills gap. And again, they are forecasting that there will be an additional 1 million open jobs created in STEM before 2020. But they're not quite sure how we're going to fill those. So there's an urgent need in STEM. I know STEAM is also really important, and I absolutely agree with that. But they're opening wides. And then OECD, the number of people forecast to be needed in the app economy is also very interesting. So the apps that we use on our mobile phones, the number of people who will be needed to work in the app economy is predicted to be 5.8 million this year. So if you can't write apps and you don't have the skills that allow you to do that, and you're looking for a job and you're 18, what do we do about that? And I think there are things that we can and should do about that. I'm going to pause a little bit on this, and we've been talking about how fast the world is changing. And we know that it sort of goes back to literally the 1920s about how slowly things were adopted. And we've got the radio, we've got the TV, we've got the internet coming on later. You've got faster adoption curves with social media, sort of Facebook. Again, the telephony was a little bit slower to take on because the infrastructure was longer to take on. These skills, so this really does show how important it is for us to help children and young people adjust to the changing world, because the world literally is getting significantly faster and it's accelerating. You talked earlier about Uber. This shows the adoption curves of Uber in different cities in the US and in China. And what it shows is that Uber's adoption in China was 479 times faster in China than it was in New York. And there's two things at work there. One is that you had a company ferociously focusing on the productivity of the people who were using their double-sided marketplace. They were focusing on the taxi drivers, making it really, 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 really easy for them to do what they'd always been doing, but making it much, much easier. So what you see here is different versions of the app that they were producing. And this is what you can do if you're a software engineer. You can try something and think it doesn't work, you drop it. Then you got version 1.2, version 1.3, version 1.4. And these cause faster adoption curves over time. And then by the time you're ready to introduce it into another city, you start getting not percentages, but 479 times. So you see an entire industry in China changing in a matter of 3 or 4 months, what historically would take decades to take place. And this is not happening only with Uber. It's happening with a number of the things. So what we're just talking about, when you start to see, again, when you've got the sort of mainframe era, you've got slow adoption curves, it's because the impact on businesses is not that high. But when you start getting extreme productivity gains, exactly what we saw with Uber, what we've also seen with LinkedIn and Facebook, you start to see really, really fast adoption curves. And software and technology and AI and machine learning enable businesses to do things that they've wanted to do for ages, but they haven't been able to do. What I think is really, really interesting, and I'll show you some slides now, is about taking the power of lessons from the Ubers and the LinkedIns and the Facebook, those industries, and you see people from those industries now applying those lessons in the world of education for the first time. And you also are starting to see extreme impact on student attainment and teacher productivity and teacher attainment. And I'm very, very excited about that because we need all the help that we can get. So again, it used to be, I was 20 years ago, started working for RM. And I was curious about it because I'd always been in the financial services industry, which was interesting, but I was really curious about education and how we could take lessons from other industries into education. And I remember thinking, oh, it's just irrational exuberance. Technology is not going to have any impact on teachers or on students, because it really wasn't back then. But there is some glimmers of hope and some really interesting examples that really do hit both teacher productivity and learner attainment, which means that those adoption curves that we have seen elsewhere in other industries are now starting to show here. And they should be our best friends ever going forward. So again, barriers to adoption eliminated. You're seeing really, really interesting amounts of money going in, not from governments into teacher attainment and productivity. It used to be exclusively that governments or local authorities would have to invest in those tools that would be used around teacher attainment and student student attainment. But you've now got 54% of all venture capital going into investing in teacher attainment and productivity and student attainment. That's very, very exciting. And they're taking those lessons from Uber and from LinkedIn and from Facebook and they're applying them to education for the first time. And we're starting to see, both from the learners themselves and from the teachers themselves, that they do appreciate and believe, and there is evidence to show that they are, hard evidence, as you said earlier, that is hard to ignore or impossible to ignore, with facts. So again, Tasha's talking about Facebook, LinkedIn. Edmodo swept the US with, again, productivity improvements for the educators. They were loved by the parents, they were loved by the teachers, and you've seen that very, very fast adoption curve, which hasn't stopped off. And they're very much trusted. So again, free to use. Why are they free to use? Because they found different business models. And as long as the students are benefiting and those are sustainable, which they are, this is a good thing. And again, parental engagement and productivity gains. Also looking a little bit about Founders4Schools, which I'm not supposed to talk with too much. But again, when you've got STEM attainment gains, time savings, it's free to use, you get a massive cost savings to the system, which will mean a faster adoption curve, which is better for everybody. I'm just going to show a little bit about the rate of growth using, and this is some of your research, so I'm really nervous exposing this to you. So we look at student-employer encounters per 1,000 of student population in the country. And then here we look at adoption curves. And what this shows is, and again, country by country introduction, sort of like city by city, and I'll show you city by city in a second. But this is showing in 2014 when this platform went live, a pretty okay adoption curve as far as adoption curves go. But when it was introduced into Scotland, you see a much faster adoption curve. And this is by the number of student-employer encounters per 1,000 between these two countries, looking at different adoption dates. Kind of like the Uber slide, but a little bit, again, just not city by city, country by country. If you want to look at it city by city, or local authority by local authority, you see also really interesting. You see this is Camden, which student-employer encounters per 1,000 students. Camden is just under 1,000 students per 1,000 encounters per 1,000 students, which means your one encounter per child per year is happening in Camden. But look what happens in Stirling, Scotland, where you've got almost double that amount in a much shorter period of time. Again, you're seeing those productivity gains and the students benefiting from that. I just break out the research in Scotland for a second, but Stirling is ahead of everybody else, as you can sort of see here. What I want to show you here is their index of multiple deprivation. So on the left-hand side is an index of multiple deprivation, so you really don't want to be down here, or you want to see more progress here than you see at the top. Now, we're not seeing that yet, but we will shortly see it. And then here is the student-employer encounters per 1,000. So if it's important that children do meet employers in their classroom, this is showing a pretty large regional variation city by city and also country by country. And we didn't used to be able to see that before, so it's wonderful to be able to see that. What this shows here is at LEP level, we couldn't decide if we wanted to do it by MP, or we wanted to do it by local authority, or we wanted to do it by LEP. So we've done it by all three. So depending on what you're interested in, you just click the research button to find out what you're interested in. At a LEP level, this shows the number of business leaders that are available to speak in classroom at any one time. It shows you their combined turnover, and it shows you on average what's the average growth per company in that area. Now, we have this information from Companies House, which is a fabulous database that the government makes available to all of us if we've got good reasons for using it. But it allows you to see the historic growth of companies in every single city around the UK, which for once allows you to see in the Isle of Wight what's the issue, or where, or Hertfordshire. Again, you can sort of see they've got a slower average growth, but at least they still have 202 companies that are in schools talking today, which is an interesting and a good thing. Just show you in Stirling again the number of bookings, student-employer encounters per 1,000 student, they're at 1408. And then you can also show that even in the last 90 days, how many encounters have happened. Now, you didn't have this transparency before. Just going to show you a little bit of a dip into Stirling's dashboard, which is for their local authority, that shows you, and I've just done a screen grab of three of the schools, but these two primary schools, or this primary school has had 10 encounters per child in the last 6 months, against the two high schools where they've had 3 each, against the whole population of the student body, which is really interesting. You can click on these and you can see by student age and by type of encounter what's going on exactly. And again, it's very, very hard to not wonder, what do those children think about when they're asked what they'll do when they grow up, compared to the neighboring school where maybe there hasn't been one encounter? And why is that good? Or why is it bad? And what are the implications for us? Also want to talk about, we're unleashing the power of students into business. If 93% of students are saying they need the power of students in their business, what are we doing about it? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about work experience now. So it is very valued. We all know this. It's more valued than a degree. It is more valued than straight A's. There are some issues with it. If you look at the age, so we've got a problem with work experience age, which we need to resolve in the next 5 years. So if you ask businesses, the growing businesses, when they want to have students with them when it's valuable to them, you only get 19% of the population saying it's valuable to them below 16 years. But if you ask what the practice is in the schools, you get a different picture, and that they prefer to do it below the age of 16. So as someone who has been making markets in a bunch of industries for a long time, this needs to be resolved or it will not succeed. There are some barriers to being able to engage employers, the employers that are creating the jobs at the moment. Now, we should resolve those. Another issue here is when we asked, is there a best time for work experience to take place? And what you can see is employers are willing to engage with work experience all throughout the year, not just in June or July. And if you look at your business inventory of people who could host, it's about 10 times greater if you don't try to cram it into June and July. Let's look at where does it come from. It doesn't come from schools. It's usually opportunistic. It's usually when someone says, oh, could you take my child or my nephew or my niece? And the employers will do that. So if that's what the inclination is, we can turn the model that there is so that it works the way it works better. Just want to look at AI and machine learning, because some people say it doesn't exist in education, and it absolutely does. And it boosts student attainment. So if you go back to work experience at the moment, and I'll just show from Workfinder, after they have applied to, in this case, Crepe Affair, we search the local businesses within a 20-minute walk of where they made that last application, and we suggest other businesses to them. Now that's absolutely using a whole bunch of different databases and AI to enhance the ability of that student to find a job, to make an opportunistic application to another company very close to them. The other thing that we've done is integrated it with life skills and a number of other sources. So what we learned also is that educators really in the schools needed secret powers of observation. So this is the profile that's been created for them, which is a productivity tool. They can see for every child in their class the cover letter, whether or not it's been accepted, whether or not they've got an offer. They can see whether or not the child has acted on the recommendation that was given to them. They can see here that this student, Jane Austen, strangely, has made 2 applications, not responded to recommendations. They can see that little Johnny hasn't done anything, so they can go say, Johnny, go talk to Jane, because Jane's been making applications, and it's really important. This puts the power into the child and uses recommendations and databases. It's really important. From the business leaders, they need a really easy way of looking at. They need a dashboard to compare the different students, so that these also exist. So this allows you to look at them. You can see the roles they're applying for, when they're available, how long they want, what the subjects are they're interested in, the attributes that they describe themselves, the industry they want to work in, and what their age, and then what you've done with them. So these tools exist, and they remove the barriers between employers and students, and most importantly, between educators' ability to see what's going on. The guidance that we give to educators is absolutely based on both Enabling Enterprise and the Gatsby Foundation work. And so if an educator who's with somebody who's 16 has just done speed mentoring, they will get a recommendation of, oh, you should try this next. And I think that's really, really important that we learn from each other and embed our recommendations there. 90 times greater if you're working alone versus working in collaboration with others. The economic impact, the cost per job created, is how we looked at it in 2014. And it was 90 times more effective if you worked in collaboration with people. So it's a call for collaboration. So national data sets, the NPD, could be made available a lot better so that we could research what's working and what's not working, and I would call upon that to happen. I think the work of Careers and Enterprise Company in particular is extraordinary in here. Funding for educational initiatives that are collaborative rather than one organization only. I think there's a really good call for that. Receive expert advice. I think that giving advice so that we have a GPS for educators so that they don't have to be experts, but they've got that at their hands is really important and capable for us. I think that every school should make sure that they know their local labor market within 4 and 50, and these tools exist. I've shown them to you earlier, and because they exist, it's important. Recommendation 5, which is going to provocation, I think getting the 140 hours of work experience between 16 and 18 is critical, but most importantly, that they are representative of companies that are hiring for the future. There's been an unintended bias historically towards large companies. Sometimes I refer to them as large shrinking companies, and we need to fix that. At times that are convenient to the employers, we do know that the employers are saying that June and July is not convenient to them, but we're not yet acting on that, and I think we should act on that and think about that. And then more importantly to me is from the learner's point of view, we need some research to show, there's little snippets and hints that learners learn better over a 10-week embedded work experience rather than just a binge in June or July. If that's the case, then we should wholesale change when we recommend work experience to take place so that it's within the term. There's been a number of practitioners that we've seen in some of the local authorities changing their process, and they forced us to embed it throughout the term for the employers, which we're happy to do. But why is it only happening in East London and in Manchester? Why shouldn't this happen if it's better for the learner that it's embedded in a term time? Why doesn't that happen everywhere? And what do we have to do to make that come about? So that's it. Sorry, I went a little bit over. But I think it almost begs more questions than answers, but I do think that the people in this room are the people who can provide the answers. So I look forward to working with you, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Sherry. Thank you.